it's the bewitching hour. So we will start out. I'm supposed to start out with great Scott. You're here at Back to the Future, choosing the right technology for your transit system. So that's probably the best I can do for today. But anyway, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Chuck Morris, and I am with the Office of Transit and Active Transportation. And we are going to review the transit technology plan that we took on about a year ago, and had consultants help us develop a plan with recommendations to deliver a full plan to the greater Minnesota with technology. Oops, that's not the enter button. To give you a little bio of myself very quickly. I started out with a psychology degree. And so I worked for 25 years with people with developmental disabilities. And I was a behavior analyst at that time. The position morphed into a large agency who needed to transport those people to and from their jobs, right? And so I became the transit director at that point. And from there, I implemented a software so they could actually be able to schedule their rides, know who was coming and going. It was a rather large agency. They were doing between 300 to 500 rides a day. So from there, I kept my eye on things, and I joined the Office of Transit, and now I am the data and technology coordinator for the office. So that's not good. Okay, so starting out with the Greater Minnesota Transit Technology Plan, this is where you can find it if you'd like to read it. That's the website for the DOT website. The plan was started in 2020 and finished this year in 2021 at about June. There are 6 chapters. And the first chapter talks about the introduction. The introduction, of course, discusses the purposes of the plan and how we decided to develop it. Across Minnesota, there's a lot of disparity with technology. Some people have routing software, some people don't. Very few people have fare collection systems. Some people have planning software where they know where they need to move their routes. MnDOT recognized that it would be a great advantage to all involved to be able to streamline that technology so that we could have more of a plan for helping the transit systems do with their reporting and being able to schedule things better, and then also being able to, collect fares, those kinds of things. On the other side, of course, it's also better for the riders. They're going to know when their ride is coming, how they're going to schedule their rides, and how they might pay for their rides. And so streamlining that is really the key for moving forwards. The second is the context for the transit technology resources. And so basically we started out the plan and we surveyed all of the Minnesota transit systems for their technology. We asked them what they were using, what they liked, what they thought they might like in the future, what works well and what doesn't. Then we moved on and they reviewed the Minnesota regional transit plans, the 20-year plan, the 5-year plans, and to see where people are at and where things were moving there. And then the next part was to go into a national peer review. And the national peer review included transit advocates, transit leaders, as well as other national transit systems. And with that, they came up with some guidance as to what might make successful projects. So this is kind of a summary, I believe, for our transit technology plan. And it's basically to understand what is the asset that we're looking for. How do we take care of all of the components within that? And then, of course, how do we support training, make plans for technology, and then of course decide to replace it and upgrade it, right? That's really the life cycle of what we're looking at to do here. And so what was interesting was they found 5 key things that made a good, successful project. Of course, the first one starts out with defining clear goals. And those goals are important because you need to find someone who's a champion for those goals, right? And that champion is going to be the person who really works to accomplish the goal, communicate why they need the goal, and then of course be able to problem solve and resolve issues for the goal's success. The second portion was talking about setting goals and of course monitoring the performance of those goals. The main piece about that is that as you are looking at your goals, you have to be flexible enough to be able to change them and upgrade them as you go along. The third thing is watching for coordination opportunities. Or actually, it's just, I like to call it just opportunities, right? Because it could be coordination, it could be grants, it could be another system that's looking for the same kinds of things that you are, and that you could work together to kind of move in that direction. And so there's a lot of importance in that, finding opportunity, because that's how things really get started and moving forwards. The fourth point is really the main key of the whole idea. And that is, you need to have a foundation with your transit, with your technology. That foundation gives you where you need to, what you currently have. And the important part about that is that you can't just say, I have a foundation. There is a lot of effort behind that foundation. You need to make sure it's continued to be updated and upgraded, and looking for additional improvements and those kinds of things. So it's not just, here's my foundation, we're just moving forwards. And then of course, the fifth piece really talks about making sure that you are able to sustain the data that it is collecting for you and maintain the cost of keeping up that information. So those are really the 5 keys that they had found. We also have a goals and strategies chapter. I'm not going to go into that real deeply, but of course it basically is getting input from all of the Office of Transit people, our transit systems, our RTC groups, and they are able to then define the goals and the strategies to get those goals met. And so there's a very large section on that. The fourth section is actually the technology management solutions section. Next couple of slides I'll show you relate to all of the areas here, but these are basically the ideas that were identified that most people need to have in technology to be able to be successful with moving that forwards. Now I realize I think these 2 slides are a little bit out of turn, but I'll start with this one, and then you'll see how it fits with the next slide. But what we did was that when they took those areas, those main headings of technology, they identified underneath each one of those technologies the specific type of technology that would address that. Okay, and so that's what's on the chart here. It shows up very nicely there. You'll see also 3 columns, because not every system is equal, right? So this tells you that the first column is a smaller transit system, somebody who has probably 1 to 9 vehicles. A mid-sized system is more than one that has 10 to 30 vehicles. And then of course, the third one is somebody who has more than 30 vehicles. And so this is a graph of what might be. It's a technology baseline, right? So if you're this size system and you're looking at, scheduling software, do we need to have an algorithm to optimize the schedule? Maybe, maybe not, right? This is just kind of a baseline as what is out there and what people are using. The blacks really are something that's recommended. The ones that are kind of half black, half white are sort of a maybe, right? And then the NAs, of course, are just not applicable at this point. And as they grow, they become more applicable. Yeah, it's actually, yeah, that's the way the consultants divided it. Typically, rural transit systems, urbans do, but not rural, have uh, they have demand response and then uh, dial ride or demand response and route deviation. I'm sorry. Yeah. All right. So this is really the chart that might have come forward first. And that is, this is what they call really a transit stack. And so they took the areas that we talked about that were the main technology areas. And then we would like to have the transit system sit down and say, well, underneath this, we have these types of softwares we use. And as you identify each under each of the categories, you'll see more about how each actually interrelates to each other. So you can't just get you may not just have a routing software. You might have a routing software that interfaces with your customer because it gives them a call, and so then you see a plan of how you are actually already using technology. And then of course, as I said, you can go back to the baseline and take a look and see what might be something you want to move forwards into the future with. The other thing I want to talk about too is that in that chapter, the Transit Technologies chapter, there's a robust discussion of each of the softwares and sort of degrees of what you can get as well, as far as the softwares that are available, from all the way from using a spreadsheet to actually using a full-blown routing software optimizing scheduling system. So it talks and gives you an idea about that, and it gives you a lot of good ideas across all of the softwares that are available. All right, so chapter 5, I believe, is the developing a transit agency assessment and growth plan. And so this is really sort of the discussion where we're going to work with our transit systems. And the first part we're going to do is put out that assessment part, right? We're going to ask the agency the context and their goals. What is their demographics? What do they plan for in the future? How large are they? What is their growth like? Those kinds of things. And then of course, goals. What are the kinds of goals that they want to move forwards with? Something they've been thinking about that might be pertinent to this situation. Then they go into the reviewing of the supports. The technology supports refers to more of the capacity of the transit system to be able to take on that growth. What is it that they actually need to take and move to the next level? And do they have enough staff? Do they have the right people that can do that? This is where they really talk about what their weaknesses are and what improvements could happen into the future. So then they go into the third step, and that's really identifying and analyzing the technology systems that they have. Using the baseline chart, using the technology stack chart, they're able to actually sit down and see what is on paper so they can evaluate from there. And then of course, the fourth piece is the analysis, and that's the SWOT analysis. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's always a trick to see if I can remember that. But that's what they do and sit down. And when they identify those things, you now have a very comprehensive plan or assessment, right, of what you have, what you might want to do moving forwards. Now, moving into the second part is the growth plan. And the growth plan is really kind of the commitment, right? You're going to take that assessment part and you're going to bring it to the decision makers in your organization or outside your organization and say, these are the kinds of things we're thinking about. Are you guys thinking about these too? Are these in our plans? Are these, the directions we want to go? And so then, of course, as that moves along, they're able to prioritize from there and select the options that they've identified. And then they can sit down and start talking about an actionable plan. And so we're going to be doing that in the future, probably starting in January with our transit systems. It's going to be in conjunction with their 5-year growth plans. So we'll have more of a round, robust system. All right, getting to the end here, wrapping up quick. I might not hit all of these because I think we're running slow on time, but there are 3 main recommendations in the plan, and under each of those is a number of recommendations, 13 to be total. So it's going to be a very long and arduous process, but it's also going to be something that's beneficial to our transit systems. But again, we're going to have to be able to sit down and really prioritize and decide what are the things we want to work on first and what kinds of things need to come along next. Part of the collaborative decision-making, of course, was talking about a committee that would help to move and prioritize that information. And we had our first meeting last Thursday. It was very productive. And I think everybody walked away with their heads shaking, thinking, wow, how are we going to get all this done? But again, when we prioritize and define our work plans, I think it's going to be very beneficial. Another area, of course, is developing new approaches to technology innovation, right? Identifying how our office or other types of technology coming in might actually benefit people and how we can actually move forwards with funding and partnerships to make those happen. The other thing of the committee and in the collaborative decision-making also works on talking about establishing ongoing communications. And that's going to be a very big key because of the fact that that's really how things are going to move forwards. We're going to have to build knowledge, talk about what we have, what others have, incentivize coordination with people, make sure that they work together to get the end goals. But also it's going to be an education portion, right? Being able to understand what technology issues are out there and what sort of solutions they could actually move towards. I like to reference the GTFS information because that's something that works great for fixed route, but is really on the move for demand response and those kinds of things. Very changing, very cutting edge, and things that many people aren't really aware of. So those are the kinds of things we'll have to work with. The second recommendation was really organizational support. And that talked a lot about the comprehensive technology training, finding out what kind of trainings are actually out there. And is there other trainings we could support and bring people into understanding the technologies that they have, but also be able to train them to better use the technologies they already have. There's always, you get a new technology and I always kind of smile because the first year is learning the program and really going to it, right? But then in the second year, you're like, well, I know this software does a whole lot more, but I don't remember what they told me and how it worked, right? So we need trainings to proliferate that information across not only transit systems, but a transit system, but all transit systems. Also having access to technology domain experts, people who already know and are using the software, that they can actually sit down and say, here's how it works for us. This is how it might work for you. That's going to be a big thing. And then of course, I'm going to roll leveraging the state procurement role and the resource library together. Those really are things that can become in the library that people can reference, so that will make it easier for them instead of having to go and write RFPs and other procurement things that are sort of off the cuff. You know, when you have a sample to follow, it'll be easier to proliferate and move forwards. The third is specifications, acquisitions, and integrations. The first one I like to talk about is the functional requirements for key systems. We need to have real rigorous specifications so that when we do write those RFPs, we know exactly what we're getting. Many times we know what the software does in general, but we don't know specifically how A fits to B. And so the more we are able to define that information, the better technology we're going to be able to implement and take on board. And then, of course, back to talk a little bit again. Oh, there's two left I'd like to talk about, and that is supporting specifications of development, talking about the standardizing of data flows, GTFS again, or other kinds of things. And then, of course, that leads into the data management, right? What kinds of APIs can we have that will move information from routing softwares into MnDOT reporting requirements, right? Those kinds of things. We're always having to look at how we can interconnect those things to make life easier for everybody. So that concludes what I have. Do you want to wait on questions, or do you want to?
Yeah, let me do the presentation and do questions.
That sounds good.
Thanks, Chuck. My name is Elliott McFadden. I work with Chuck in the IDEA unit in the Office of Transit and Active Transportation at MnDOT. I am the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator, and I have the pleasure of working on several innovative projects that are coming out of MnDOT. We don't yet have a project that will create transit around a DeLorean, but we'll see what happens maybe in the future. Or perhaps the flux capacitor in every bus. Just a little bit about me. I am a recent addition to MnDOT. I joined in the organization in January of 2020. I come with a 15-year experience on the private sector side, working in shared mobility. I founded the first car sharing service in the state of Texas, and then was the founding CEO of the City Bike Share program in Austin, Texas. Also innovated around electric seated scooters and dockless bike share. I co-founded the trade association for the industry, and I was project lead for our product development team at B-Cycle, developing new products with our vendor and other companies. So I have quite a lot of experience bringing innovative projects to market and using a model called Lean Startup, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects that we're working on, and then this model that I have used. Once you get past the more strategic planning into the nitty-gritty of how are we going to actually test this technology and see if this is the right decision, a possible model that you could look at and use. The program itself started out as our state rideshare program and was expanded before I was brought on to encompass all shared mobility technologies in Greater Minnesota. So a big focus of my program work is building general knowledge and understanding of the industry, looking for opportunities for us to pilot shared mobility in Greater Minnesota, and then building a network of transit industry and shared mobility folks who are interested in working in this space and connecting them together. One of the first projects I worked on coming in was looking at an assessment of where we are in Greater Minnesota. So my work plan was in March, mid-March of 2020, I was going to go around the state and meet with all of you one-on-one, face-to-face, and then coronavirus hit. So ended up doing a series of interviews with all the agencies. And what we found was there is a pretty vibrant shared mobility ecosystem. It may not be the big Silicon Valley shared mobility, but there's lots of options out there. But there were also some failures. There were some areas where people had services and they went away. And generally, there is a lot of interest around the state in looking at shared mobility options to fill in need where transit might be harder to meet need. Part of that analysis was identifying 14 potential areas where we could look at pilots. Because of coronavirus and all the other things going on, we have not moved to the next step of actually looking at how we're going to identify and then potentially fund some of those. But that's a process we are working on. But there is a lot of interest out there. The other thing that we started was in last fall, our shared mobility webinars. So this was part of that, getting folks more familiar with the different options that are out there and as a knowledge share. So we brought in speakers from all over the country with different expertise. This included GTFS, microtransit, mobility hubs, and mobility as a service. All of those are recorded and on our MnDOT transit page. So if you missed any of them or you're interested, you can take a look at those. And then we will be looking at restarting those here in the near future. One of the first other projects that I worked on is the ABC Ramps Flex Pass project in Minneapolis. So MnDOT owns the largest parking facilities in downtown Minneapolis. And part of that stewardship of those facilities is trying to decrease SOV trips, and carpooling has been something that's been in decline. So looking at other products and other ways we can do that. So we're putting our foot into the initial model of doing what's called a mobility wallet, a subscription where you have different options with a single monthly rate. So we're right now testing a limited parking pass, which is more geared towards teleworkers, and then a similar pass that is combined with a parking pass with Metro Transit, and potentially in the future looking at adding other shared mobility options to that. There's a discount on the price people pay. And then fortunately, we were able to use the Metro card, the Go-To card, as the medium. So that actually works in our parking facility. So folks have that card in their pocket. Tori mentioned this. We received a grant from the Federal Transit Administration under their AIM project that's accelerating innovative mobility. And it's to build a mobility as a service platform. So what we mean by MOS is a single place where residents and visitors can look at all of their mobility options, plan, book, and track those trips. Transit's the backbone of that, but we are also looking to add every other sort of shared mobility provider in the area and new and emerging technologies like connected and autonomous vehicles. And this pilot's going to focus on 7 transit systems plus private providers in southern Minnesota. And so right here, the 7 systems that we're partnering with, we've got 2 small urban systems and 5 rural systems. And the idea here is this is a microcosm of greater Minnesota, the different kinds of transit agencies we have, to better understand how this would work in different communities around the state. One of the things, this is the platform or the different components. One of the things that we're doing that's a little bit different is we're making the connections and the communications between all the different software an open platform. So what that means, traditionally, you would hire an app company that would build this trip planning app, and they would go and do all these things called APIs, which that's the communication between the different software. So those are the arrows. And what we've done is decoupled that and made that an independent part of this project, which is going to allow that information to flow to other applications. We will have an app as part of this project, but we're under no illusion that we're gonna, as a DOT, be like an app company and take over the app space. We want this data to flow to other trip planning applications, or if a transit agency wants to partner with a service provider and combine services on an app, we're going to facilitate that. So we're going to be looking at integrating the dispatching and operational software, data feeds, e-ticketing, and then also being able to pull in all that information into better planning. We're also going to have a large focus on data specifications. So the general transit feed specification, GTFS, our industry standard for displaying discovery information, routes, timetables, fares. Those data feeds will be provided to all of the agencies that are partnering with us, including GTFS Flex, which is a new version of that, which allows demand response services to show up in trip searches. We're also working on a couple of emerging specs. So there is the demand response transactional data spec. So that's the actual getting away from trip planning to the information when somebody actually books a trip, making that information standardized. And by focusing on all these standards, what we're doing is we're making it easier for interoperability. If the vendor and the different providers all speak the same language, they all speak the same spec, it's easier for us to integrate. And if you decide to change a vendor at some point, you have a standard language that your new vendor can then adapt to. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at the general on-demand feed specification, or GOFS, which is focused on ride hail, taxis, and microtransit. So having something similar to GTFS for those services. And then partnering with one of our car share systems to adapt the GBFS, which is for bikes and scooters, to car share. So looking at how can we standardize all of the information that's flowing to make easier interoperability. We are also doing a contactless payment pilot as an extension of some COVID research. So this morning, Tori mentioned that we are partnering with the University of Minnesota to look at strategies and tactics that you can use to help bring ridership back as we come out of COVID. As part of that, we applied for an FTA grant to actually dig a little deeper into contactless payment, because we had 3 agencies that were bringing on a fare card system. We wanted to look also at app-based systems. So we're going to be looking at comparing those technologies, the pluses and minuses, and how they can address safety and convenience for riders. And so we've got 8 rural systems. 5 of them will be testing in Western Minnesota. 5 will be testing e-ticketing on an app-based platform. 3 will be testing fare card. Then the university will be our research component. And then we've been also working with the dispatching and routing software companies to look at how we can integrate into the trip planning applications that'll come out of this, so we can look at booking as well. So all of this are ideas that we're looking at as proof of concept to see what we can do beyond the pilot stage. So how can we evaluate this working within MnDOT and also with Minnesota IT? What is the value of this technology? What's our return on investment? What are the challenges that we're going to need to overcome? And then what do we want to scale statewide? And then what are the other data sets that we need to be looking at to help improve integration? And then longer term, how do we make this part of the broader ecosystem? This isn't just transit, it isn't just shared mobility. The personal automobile needs to be a part of this conversation as well. And so how tolling and parking might be integrated into a MOS platform, and maybe creating incentives depending on congestion or pollution that could nudge people towards transit and other options. Curb management, so in places where you have lots of vehicles accessing the same space, how do you manage that? And then as we look at a distance-based fee, how that could be integrated into this as well as a replacement for the gas tax. So that's a whirlwind summary of my last 18 months at MnDOT. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about is the model that I use, that I've been using in innovative projects before, for you to think about once you're looking at a technology, and how do you get over some of the challenges of implementing technology? So those challenges are the risk, right? You're doing something you've never done before. There could be huge upside. There could be huge downside. You know, how do you mitigate that? The other thing is that any technology you look at, it's not going to be set it and forget it. You know, the procurement is not the end of your conversation. The deployment of the technology is not the end. You're going to have to keep working on it until you get it to a stage that that you like. And then also, how do you know if it's a success? How do you know when you have gotten to a stage where it's time to cut bait and do something different? I'm going to be talking about Lean Startup, which is a a model of innovative project management that came out of the tech industry to address some of these similar issues where you had people with an idea to do something, but they would spend all this investor money and build something and then throw it out in the market and it would be a dud. So how do you get around that? So you don't, in a similar way, we're spending public dollars. How do we avoid a dud? So first thing is reducing risk. So I think before you spend any money, you need to take some time to think about your actual solution. And is it solving a problem that's worth solving? You know, how are you dealing with the problem today that you're trying to solve with the technology? Is that good enough? Or is there a lot of upside to doing that? And then get out of the building and talk to people. Whoever it is, whether it's your customer or if it's something you're doing operationally and you need it and it's going to impact staff, talk to the people that are going to be impacted by the technology and see what they have to say. See how important this is to them. Is this just a nice to have thing, or is this really a pain point that they desperately want to solve? And then out of that, you look at building what we call an MVP, which is a minimal viable product. And I have a little diagram here, and it says, you know, minimum is a crappy product that nobody wants to use. Viable is the thing that you're dreaming of. And when you put them together, it's sort of the minimum amount of features that you can put together to test the idea before you have to spend all the money actually developing it. And then this kind of whole thing is most products, most of the rest of the stuff you do in a product is waste. You know, if you spend time on it without building that, you're spinning your wheels. And the important thing is here, don't scale, don't get into, you know, spending the money to make a long-term commitment until you see success. So then we have the actual lean startup model, which is a model for continuous improvement. So it's build, measure, learn, rinse, repeat, do this over and over again. So you take your minimum viable product, and that can be as simple as a PowerPoint deck that shows the vision of what you think you want to build. Some examples in transit and active transportation that have been done is, say you think you want to do a bus only lane. Well, for a week, put up barriers on a street that can be removed to test the idea out. That would be a minimum viable product. Similar thing with bike infrastructure. What we've seen, especially during the pandemic, putting out temporary barriers to create safe places for people to walk and bike. People can visualize it. You can see what works, what doesn't, get feedback from the public without having to spend all of that time and money building something that maybe people don't want. Then you're going to measure what happens when the customer sees this minimum viable product and interacts with it, and figure out what they like and what they don't like. What is I have to have, this would be transformative for me. What is, that's kind of nice, but you know, it's not that important. And you repeat this process over and over again until you get your product to where you feel comfortable that you've got something that you can go out and scale with. And then finally, how do you know when to continue, when to scale, or when to pivot? So the first thing is, before you start, it's very important that you define what are going to be your metrics for success. You know, what are you trying to get out of this? What's the improvement that you'd like to see? This isn't technology just for technology's sake. It's solving a problem. It's increasing rider satisfaction. It's reducing operational cost. It's bringing new riders in. What do you think is going to happen? And put that out there before you do anything, because it's really easy if you don't set those things out to kind of get to the end of a project and not know, well, was this successful or not? It kind of felt good. It felt nice. I liked it, but you don't have any objective sense of whether it's a success or not. And then when you're choosing your metrics to measure, make sure that they're actually tell you something. I say avoid vanity metrics. An example of a vanity metric would be number of rides. That is a number that will, over time, will always go up. Number of rides per day, number of rides per week, number of new riders per day per week. That is not a vanity metric because that tells you what the impact of the technology was. And then keep running this cycle until you dialed in and found success. Or, and this happens in the tech community all the time too, you run out of time, money, or ideas, and then it's time to move on. So it shows the 3 stages here, the problem solution fit. So that's your research time where you're really trying to find out, is this worthwhile? And I did this in bike share. We had a community that asked us over and over again to expand bike share into this community. And that's a very expensive, time-consuming proposition. And so we put together some interviews with people in the community who said that they wanted this, and people weren't showing up to interviews. And that told me, like, okay, this isn't that important. You know, there isn't that much need. And then our analysis said, you know, it doesn't have all the factors that we need. So looking at that problem solution fit, we shut down that project right there. We didn't spend any more resources because we understood that, you know, before we spent any money, whether this was worth our time. Then the product market fit, that's your minimum viable product. That's your time spent really trying to dial that in and make it work and solve the problems and actually work the way you want it to work. And then there's scaling. And so really at the end of when you feel like you've got something that where you've tested it and you think you've got it, that's the time, if you've got funding, that's the time when you would move forward to really scale this up and make this part of your system, or go after grant dollars. That's a great time. If you go to a grant funder and you have all of this market data and shown that there's this demand and people love this idea, your chances of getting funding are going to be greatly increased. I'm going to just end. This was a very, very high level overview. If there's more interest in this, I'd love to do some trainings in the future, but I wanted to share 3 books that I think are really good reading if you're interested more in this process. First is Lean Startup. Eric Ries is the guy who came up with this idea. And that's a great introductory book. But if you want to actually run a project, Running Lean and Scaling Lean by Ash Moraria are really great, nitty gritty detailed. This is how I get from A to B using this process. But again, I think it's a really great thing we can take from the private sector and could be applicable in any kind of project to reduce risk and increase your chance of success. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and take questions. Right. When a vanity metric is something that always will go one direction, right? It's going to go up no matter what you do. For a metric to have value, you need to see, last week this solution wasn't in the market. This week it is. What was its impact? And that's why when you look at what is the rate over time, that's a very good way to look at it because you can see what the impact of the technology was. Another one would be breaking it up, comparing this, the people who are using the technology versus people who are not using the technology. Mm-hmm. So like if there was always a decline, it might be because of your problem. Correct. 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 Yeah. You had a question? Mhm. So the question is, we've got rural communities. Have we applied these shared mobility like projects? Sure. Sure, sure. The projects that I've worked on to date have been definitely in a more urban environment. What I think one of the reasons why I did the analysis was it was a chance to talk to each system and understand what their situation is, what their problems were. And I think when you look at that, you can identify what potential services and technologies could work there. I think what's exciting about MnDOT being involved in this process, and I don't know of any other state DOT that's really taking a role in shared mobility in this way, is the private sector, there's all this focus on the big urban centers that's driven by Silicon Valley because they're looking at sheer market size. But I think there are a lot of services. I think van pools, I think car share, I think different partnerships with taxis and ride hail, things like that could be very applicable in rural areas. I think even bike shares and scooters in small communities could still be an option, but without the leadership of MnDOT helping to facilitate those conversations and perhaps doing some piloting, I think it'll be hard to get the market guys to look at us. And so I think, I can't tell you for sure. Part of it is these are pilots to experiment and see what works. But I'm really excited because I think a lot of the challenges that we have, I think transit systems do an amazing job, but there are little gaps here and there. And if we can find providers that can partner with you and help fill in those gaps, then I think we're going to really serve the community better. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, for anybody that didn't hear online, so it's talking about in Wisconsin, they have a project where you're bringing together the different public providers into a single platform, and that's really part of why we're looking at this mobility as a service as well. We have some goals at MnDOT as well to look at all the different kind of providers and how we can better coordinate. But to your point, if we implement these technologies, we have the potential for better coordination, better ride sharing, where one provider may have excess capacity and can bring that on. And we've seen Flex Denmark is an excellent example in Europe where they've done this with non-emergency medical services. Mhm. That's great. Mhm. Yes, we were part of that. We were part of a expert subpanel to take a look at it. Mhm. Right. Right. So I think the thing about this whole conversation is the technology is actually not really the hard part of this conversation. You know, that part's just money, really. The hard part is bringing all these groups together and showing that there's value, you know, that getting the different transit agencies to identify what's a pain point and how this might help them. And then also on the private sector side, you know, with dispatching routing software, with the different trip planning applications, with the different providers, you know, how this actually can help them as well. So we have regional transportation coordination councils that are funded by MnDOT, and those are regional groups that are looking at more of the implementation of those plans. And so my project right now doesn't deal with non-emergency medical and that, because that's just another layer of complication and policy that we want to get the base technology down. But certainly in the future, we would see that as an opportunity. Hopefully so. Hopefully so. Other questions? Wow, it looks like we've come back to the future with 7 minutes left. So well, I appreciate it. If you have other questions for Chuck or me, we are around and happy to help. Thank you.